Good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait till everyone trickles in. Great to see you. Welcome to our Clean Energy Solutions Center webinar series. Good afternoon, good evening for some of you. We'll give everybody a minute to go ahead and trickle in, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we're going to get started. So hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us and welcome from around the world. If it's morning, afternoon, or evening, great to see you. Welcome to our fourth of 7 in our hydrogen webinar series. It's hydrogen and analytical tools. So again, this is our fourth webinar in this series. We're really excited that you can join us. Hopefully many of you are returning after seeing the previous webinar series. If not, you can always access them on the Clean Energy Solutions Center website. So we're going to go ahead and get started now. This webinar is focused on hydrogen markets. But before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Sophie Schrader to go through some housekeeping issues first.
Hello, everyone. As you may have noticed as you joined today's meeting, we are recording this session, and the recording will be shared with all attendees after we conclude. You are automatically muted upon joining and throughout the webinar, but we really encourage you to use the chat feature to add whatever comments and input that you may have. And also, please do use the Q&A function if you have any questions that you would like to be addressed by our panelists. If you encounter any technical issues, please reach out to myself, Sophie Schrader, or Holly Darrow. And you can also adjust your audio through audio settings. If you have any issues, you can also dial in and listen by phone. And that information can be found in the registration email. We also will be launching a survey when the event ends. So please do fill it out because we really do value your feedback. And back to you, Daniella.
Thanks so much. So before we get started, we'd love to get to know all of you. And I know there's a lot of folks on the line. So if you don't mind putting your name and where you're from, even in your institution, if you'd like, that would be great. We'd just love to know who we're speaking with and who's listening. So again, as I mentioned, this is our fourth hydrogen webinar in our series, and this webinar is focused on hydrogen markets. So our first webinar went into kind of hydrogen 101 topics, and then we, in our second webinar, we discussed hydrogen to support climate targets. Our third webinar was focused on technical considerations for hydrogen projects. But in today's webinar on hydrogen markets, we're going to be looking at understanding different market dynamics for near-term export or even long-term export of hydrogen, potential challenges associated with that, even looking at derivatives of hydrogen, power to X, looking at technical considerations for export of hydrogen and derivatives or other products, considering economic considerations for hydrogen and market considerations associated with that, and also just an overview of a different tool that we're going to dive into today, which is called the Rodeo tool. And so we've been trying to incorporate different open source national lab tools in each of our webinars to give you an idea of all of these resources that are available to you. So really excited to be able to share this webinar with you guys today, and we'll go on to the next slide to look at the agenda. So kicking off, we're just going to have this brief introduction. We've already gone through housekeeping. Then we're going to dive into a quick overview from our representative from the Department of Energy, Office of International Affairs, Timothy Walters, who's going to be sharing with us a bit of the Department of Energy's regional strategy for the Western Hemisphere for hydrogen. So really excited to have that overview. And then we're going to dive into a more broad overview of global hydrogen markets, which is going to be presented by Jesse Cruce. Then we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A. As Sophie mentioned, any questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the Q&A when you have them. And if it seems appropriate, we'd be happy to dive into those questions during the presentation as well. But if not, we can always address them at the end of each of the presenters' time period. Then we're going to have Omar Guerra present the Rodeo tool that I mentioned, a really exciting tool that helps you to analyze economic opportunities associated with hydrogen projects. And again, we'll have a Q&A and a wrap up. So our webinar is 2 hours today, and we're really excited to get started with a brief presentation of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, and then we'll dive into the rest of our presentation scheduled for today. So Again, as I mentioned, our presenters are myself from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We have Timothy Walters, who is an international advisor for the Department of Energy's Office of International Affairs, who's been tasked with developing the hydrogen strategy for the Western Hemisphere. Definitely no easy task, so excited to hear more about that. Jesse Cruce is an energy researcher and analyst with the Markets and Policy Analysis Group in the Strategic Energy Analysis Center at NREL. His current work includes data analysis for rooftop solar permitting and interconnection processes, geothermal energy on public lands, and hydrogen economy strategies. He has a background in energy system modeling and techno-economic analysis. And our last presenter is going to be Omar Guerra, a research engineer also at NREL in the Distribution Edge Group within the Grid Planning and Analysis Center. Omar is conducting research to develop better understanding of the economics of renewable energy technologies, including energy storage, hydrogen, wind power, solar PV power, and other cutting edge technologies. So before we get started, we're going to pass the word over to Jal Desai, who's going to give us a brief presentation on the Clean Energy Solutions Center, and then we'll dive into our presentations. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Daniella. Next slide, please. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Again, thank you all for joining today's webinar. My name is Jal Desai. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And as Daniella mentioned, I'll give a brief overview about the Clean Energy Solutions Center. So Clean Energy Solutions Center, or Solution Center, is one of the work streams of the Clean Energy Ministerial. The objective of Solution Center is to accelerate the transition of clean energy markets and technologies in developing nations and emerging economies. This initiative is co-led by Australia and US, and NREL is the operating agent of this initiative. And we have more than 40 partners that we are working with. Next slide, please. So basically, Solution Center provides 3 services. So the first one is Ask an Expert service. And all of the services are free for developing and emerging economies. So the first one, as I mentioned, is Ask an Expert. So it is designed to help policymakers in developing countries, emerging economies, to identify and implement clean energy policy and finance solutions. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to us and we will be able to provide support to that request. We have more than 50 experts from around 15 countries, and to date, we have responded to 300 plus requests submitted by 90 plus governments at local, regional, and national level. And again, this service is free for developing and emerging economies. The second service is training and capacity building. So we have delivered over 300 webinars, training more than 20,000 public and private sector stakeholders. And again, we try to do one webinar every month or more, depending on the interest and topic areas that we get. And the last one is resource library. So we have over 1,500 curated reports, policy brief, and journal articles that you can refer to. And the great thing about Clean Energy Solutions Center is technology, it's technology agnostic. So you might be able to find topic areas, right, related to your interests. It can be hydrogen, right, what we are listening at, what you have dialed in today, right, or workforce development or solar, right? So I would really appreciate if you all could check the website, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Jal. So with that, we're going to pass the mic over to Timothy Walters with the Department of Energy, Office of International Affairs, to share a bit on the Western strategy for hydrogen. Over to you, Timothy.
Thank you, Daniella, and thank you to NREL and the Clean Energy Solutions Center for allowing me to speak to the regional hydrogen strategy for the Western Hemisphere. As I was introduced, I'm Tim Walters. I was tasked to about two or 3 years ago to start looking into all the requests from partner nations within the Western Hemisphere on our engagement and ways to develop and try to accelerate the deployment of clean hydrogen. Not only will it meet, help meet some of our the United States's internal domestic goals, but also looking to help support the region and working with our partners to come together and really strengthen the clean hydrogen economies within the Western Hemisphere, so that we can rapidly, implement the technologies that are available, and also kind of accelerate the research and development areas within the clean hydrogen structure to be implemented within the region as well. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. And so I'll just give a kind of a brief overview of kind of leaning it more towards the market question and what we're doing within the United States, and then how I am translating that into kind of the goals and efforts that we're undertaking in the Western Hemisphere. So with that, as many of you know, the United States, we published our National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap last year, June. And with that, some of our main kind of goals have been to create a market for us to produce about 50 million metric tons of clean hydrogen by 2050. And I mean, that feat in itself is astronomical. So we're putting in within the Biden-Harris administration many tools and funding as we can to help to really try to reach these goals. And with the kind of clean hydrogen production of the 50 million metric tons by 2050, we're working to balance that with roughly what we see as the demand within the United States. And so as countries look, and some are looking, projecting outwards to potential markets in Europe or Asia, for us in the United States, of course, we're a very market-based society, so things can always change. But focusing on kind of like the more internal demand market signals for us, and then potentially looking to explore elsewhere with that. And with some of the support, I'm sure many of you have heard of the H2 hubs, or the hydrogen hubs, that are 7 of the hubs that are the $7 billion for the hydrogen hubs that were allocated within the various regions of the United States. They're currently undergoing their contract negotiation for the ones that were selected. And once they confirm and the contracts are ready to go, they will start operating and be kind of public-private partnerships, with $7 billion of the dollars coming from funding from the U.S. government, and with the total of the hubs matching from the private sector side has been over 50 or close to $50 billion. So that's substantial amount of money that is going into this effort, and hopefully help great increase the supply of clean hydrogen, and then as well as help with the kind of signaling for the demand side as well. And then I just wanted to briefly talk about how we're operating within the United States government and moving forward with this. We have this hydrogen interagency task force that's led by our White House, and we're working to really just integrate the whole government approach because the clean hydrogen applications are so cross-cutting across so many of the agencies. And so this is a way that we move forward. I'm trying to take that same model of this interagency and applying it to kind of the Western Hemisphere efforts that I'm trying to undertake to help, increase our cooperation and partnerships with our partner nations throughout the region. And then lastly, of course, Secretary Granholm announced the hydrogen shot, which is tied to our overall hydrogen strategy of reducing the cost of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. And hopefully we can get, that to reducing it by 80% from to $1 per 1 kilogram in 1 decade. So we call that the 1-1-1 approach. So a lot of stuff moving forward. We just actually had a FOA announced for $750 million on growing hydrogen for our industry partners. So hopefully many will have seen that. So just kind of showing what the United States is doing on kind of the US front, and then how that kind of translates and ties into what I'm trying to do on the Western Hemisphere. And so within the Western Hemisphere, through my discussions with many of the governments throughout the region over the last couple of years, I had to take into what I identified with what the U.S. Department of Energy can help support the region, and also where the region can help, partner and support the United States' clean hydrogen goals. And so 3 of the areas have come up where I think the United States Department of Energy can really help make inroads into really accelerating the deployment and development of clean hydrogen in the region. And of course, the first one, which should be always on everyone's minds, is the safety component piece, and looking at ways to whatever type of clean hydrogen application or production or technology that your country is looking into. What my aim is to make sure that we share the best practices, the most the standards, the regulations, the codes that are needed for an effective and useful use of that form of clean hydrogen. And because any kind of setbacks are also going to be a setback to not only that region, but potentially a global impact. The next one is on the certification piece, more on understanding the carbon emissions. It's, a real, big concern for the United States, and one of the main efforts on why we're promoting the clean hydrogen technology and product, because we're trying to really reduce the emissions, specifically in carbon, to try to have cleaner types of if it's industry, if it's transportation, or even in agriculture like fertilizer. But we're looking at ways that we can use our current models, like the GREAT model that we use from Argonne National Laboratory, and looking to provide training opportunities for countries that may be interested in finding ways that they can help measure their own carbon emissions, as well as, within specifically in the Latin America region, water scarcity is a big concern as well. And this model can help provide for that as well. And then lastly, but just as important, is our community engagement efforts. So this has actually been something that the United States, as well as many of the countries in the region, I think we have a great understanding that in accelerating or deploying or marketing the clean hydrogen value chain or production, that we need that community buy-in. We need for us to have that outreach within the communities to let them know what this technology is. Some of the technologies that we have in this industry have been around for a very long time, but now we're just trying to market it and scale it. But there is a lot of reservations within not only the United States, but across the Western Hemisphere. And so one of my efforts is to try to come together, identify lessons learned, tools, areas where we can engage communities at large to understand what it is that we're trying to do, and how clean hydrogen can benefit economically, environmentally, through kind of environmental justice needs, and also help really the companies to be able to to mitigate the kind of the barriers that oftentimes come for when people are trying to promote new energy type projects. And so what we're trying to do with the efforts in the three areas is really trying to mitigate any kind of barriers or provide information so that we can try to really accelerate the deployment of this technology, given that our goals are quite ambitious, and we need to when we're trying to implement or integrate a new type of emerging technology like within the energy space, it takes time, but in this case we don't have time, and so we really want to put our efforts forward, and we're in the United States we believe that we're doing that through the various efforts that I've outlined earlier, and then hopefully with all this cooperation, our goal is to as I said, get it out there, developed and deployed within the communities in the Western Hemisphere, and then as well as through all our partnerships, help kind of reduce the cost of the technology usage in clean hydrogen. So that's it for my presentation. I appreciate it, and back to you, Daniella. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, really important to approach this from a regional perspective to maximize opportunities and really drive the market forward. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A, mostly focused on the hydrogen hubs. They wanted to understand, is it correct that 7 billion is provided by the government and private sector is providing 50 billion? So is that the total for the 7 hubs? And then also related to that, what drove the location decision of those 7 hubs and where are they?
Okay, yeah, great questions. So within so not my area of control or oversight, but I at least have some knowledge of what it is that we're doing within this space. And so I know some of the criteria was outlined within the funding opportunity announcement, and part of that criteria was that they had to show that there was a community benefit to the region. They had to show that there were multiple areas of within the hydrogen value chains that they were working on. They had to make sure that within the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, OCED, which is the office that manages the H2 hubs programs, had to have all these various criterias within kind of the selection. And then there is within our energy.gov website, there is a kind of fact sheet on what it is that we actually looked into more specifically on the various projects. And it's all public information so that we can make sure that we're being as transparent as possible. And I think the other question was, with the matching. Yes, so there was 7 billion that's being allocated from the United States government within a sector a time frame. I think it's like 3 or 4 years. And then there was nearly about 50 billion that will be matched by recipients that are part of the hydrogen hubs. And so, I mean, that's fantastic. So yeah, it's overwhelming with the amount of money that this area of technology. I've been in the Department of Energy for 12 years now, and I think I worked once in clean hydrogen on an issue back in the early 2012 or 13, and ever since like around 2020, 2021, the rhetoric or the amount of interest in this technology has, I mean, greatly increased, and not, I can't even like quadruple, not even like it's been so so much of a priority now, and that we're putting in billions of dollars when before it was only millions of dollars. So it just kind of goes to show like what the United States government and really is trying to drive forward with kind of the clean hydrogen economy within the United States as well as within the global outreach.
Mhm. Great, thank you. There was a hand up by Maria Borges as well, but I don't know if the hand went down. Was your question answered? And feel free to put it in the Q&A as well. Okay, looks like she dropped her hand. So I think those are all the questions for now. Thanks very much for those responses. Okay, great. And any other questions that come up, you can put them in the Q&A and Tim will hopefully be able to respond to them online. And we can also address them later in the Q&A as well. Thanks so much, Tim. Much appreciated. Okay, all right. We're going to move on now to an overview of hydrogen markets presented by Jesse Cruce from NREL. Over to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Daniella. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about sort of two interrelated aspects related to hydrogen markets. We're going to start with sort of an overview of hydrogen demand and potential projections for that demand, especially over the next 10 years. And then after we sort of lay that groundwork, we're going to talk more about sort of exports of hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives and what the sort of realm of export looks like at the moment. So you can go to the next slide. So starting with the hydrogen demand and market projections, you can do the next slide. So to take a step back, hydrogen over the last couple of years has become very much a buzzword in the energy sphere. And part of the reason why there's so much buzz around hydrogen is hydrogen has the potential to help with a lot of these energy and industrial sectors that are otherwise hard to decarbonize. So when we say something is hard to decarbonize, what we're really saying is that there aren't very good alternatives to the existing technologies that are getting used for these sectors. Electrification isn't a particularly good option. And so hydrogen could play a role in these particular sectors. Some of the key challenge areas of these hard to decarbonize sectors include electric resource adequacy. So this is load following electricity or dispatchable electricity during periods of high demand throughout the year. Iron and steel, cement, and some other industrial uses of hydrogen are also potential options. And then finally, long distance transportation, especially aviation, shipping, and potentially long distance freight. So you can go to the next slide. And so within a lot of these sectors, there's different levels of potential that hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives could have as a decarbonization route or as an energy route for those sectors. So this figure shows what some of these different sectors are and how likely hydrogen is to play a major role in them. So you can see the dark green sectors. This is chemicals, iron and steel, or long distance transportation and refining. These are all areas where hydrogen has very strong potential to have a significant demand and not a significant amount of competition against other kinds of technologies. For the other sectors that are in the lighter green, so this includes industry, cement, some shorter distance transportation such as buses, as well as building heating and power generation. There's a role that hydrogen can play, but hydrogen may not be the only likely player for those sectors, and hydrogen may have to compete against other alternative technologies, especially from an economic standpoint. And so what this means is there are some areas where we expect to see a lot of hydrogen demand, but a lot of the other potential areas that often get discussed in relation to hydrogen may or may not necessarily see hydrogen demands very early on or very significantly even through 2050. So you can go to the next slide. So I talked about areas where hydrogen is competing against alternative technologies. And this figure shows what some of that competition looks like. In the top of the figure, you can see those red boxes. So this is those red boxes are particular uses where hydrogen is most likely to be the most competitive alternative for those uses. So this is especially fertilizer production or ammonia production, and then several uses associated with refining and fuel production. The uses in green are also potential uses for hydrogen, but in these particular uses, hydrogen may be competing against other types of technologies, especially biofuels or other fuels derived from biomass or waste. And so those include methanol, some of those transportation uses that I mentioned, chemical feedstocks, things like that. For all of the uses in yellow, most of these uses have likely options for electrification, some combination of batteries or heat pumps or something like that. And so hydrogen and uses in these cases are going to be a little bit more niche or very specific uses where for some reason electrification isn't working. But thinking about hydrogen as a competitor against the next lowest cost alternative technology helps give us an idea of where hydrogen demand's likely to start and how big are those demands likely to be in 10 years and in 30 years. So you can go to the next slide. So I've been talking about hydrogen demands purely from an economic standpoint. And from an economic standpoint, hydrogen demands and their adoption into some of these use cases is really going to be driven by what's the price of hydrogen, particularly what's the price of hydrogen when you deliver it to the end user. And so for all of these different types of use cases, end users are going to have some sort of highest hydrogen price that they're willing to pay in order to start adopting hydrogen into that sector. And so what you can see on the left side of the graph is medium and heavy duty vehicles and transportation fuels have a relatively high threshold price that they're willing to pay for hydrogen. For perhaps even $5 per kilogram can still be competitive against the next lowest cost technology. On the other hand, most of the other uses from a purely economic standpoint aren't really going to become competitive for hydrogen until we get down to the maybe $1.50 or $2 per kilogram range. And so this includes biofuels, ammonia production, steel, methanol, energy storage. So what this really is showing us is that from a purely economic standpoint, the lower the cost of hydrogen, the more likely there is to be a larger demand and demand spread across various different sectors. And of course, I've only been talking about this from an economic standpoint. Obviously, lots of different countries have decarbonization policies, energy policies, industrial policies, and those policies may also include incorporating clean hydrogen into the energy or the industrial system, even before hydrogen would be economically competitive by itself. So for instance, the European Union has a target that by 2030, 42% of ammonia will be made with green hydrogen. And so from a purely economic standpoint, this green ammonia may or may not be price competitive against ammonia made from natural gas. However, there's still going to be a hydrogen demand because it's part of that policy framework. So we can go to the next slide. So multiple countries across the world have already started putting into place hydrogen demands, and there have been off-takers who have already announced agreements to buy hydrogen from producers by 2030. And so what we see in this graph is that a large amount of these existing agreements as of the end of last year are for hydrogen usage in the chemicals industry. So especially ammonia as well as methanol. We also see some smaller demands for refining, for oil refining, and for various types of transportation fuel. So including shipping fuel, sustainable aviation fuels, and other synthetic fuels. And then finally, some hydrogen demand for natural gas blending projects, including for power generation and energy storage. So for instance, in the United States, there's a project in Utah where they are building a salt cavern to store hydrogen and then using that for power production throughout different times of the year. So we can go to the next slide. However, so I've talked a lot about the potential for hydrogen demand and showed a little bit about existing off-taker agreements for hydrogen. But one of the challenges is that there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the actual demand for hydrogen is going to be through 2030 or the early 2030s. And so for market players, companies who may be producing or purchasing hydrogen, this is seen as a major risk. At the moment, as you can see in the figure, the production targets, which are shown in orange, outnumber the actual demand agreements by about 2 to 2.5 times. So what this means is that a lot of countries have come up with targets to produce hydrogen, either for internal use or for export. But a lot of those targets aren't necessarily being met with similar amounts of targets for hydrogen demand. And so this is a major concern right now. And what it may mean is that we may need more policies and support to help bolster and focus on hydrogen demand, especially at the early stages of this market development. Without these sorts of policies and support, we may run into an issue where the high cost of hydrogen and the high cost of switching from an existing technology to hydrogen may make it not economically feasible for a lot of potential hydrogen demand and a lot of hydrogen users to switch within the next 10 years. So we can go to the next slide. The last sort of lever within this hydrogen demand discussion comes with the certification and standards about what actually qualifies as low carbon, renewable, or clean hydrogen. We could spend an entire presentation talking about these standards and what's happening. I'll just note that there's several different groups that are working on developing these standards or certifications. And functionally, what they'll do is they'll set emissions levels for different kinds of hydrogen production. And this is important because hydrogen that is renewable versus low carbon may have slightly different demand profiles, especially when we start talking about countries that are including hydrogen within an energy strategy or within policies as a way to decarbonize. And so some hydrogen demand uses may actually be higher or lower based on whether or not the hydrogen that they're using has to be renewable or can just qualify as low carbon. And so once again, this is a much deeper conversation that could have its own entirely new presentation. So we'll just leave this as sort of an introductory topic for now. So we'll go to the next slide. So turning to look at the export side of hydrogen, we can do the next slide. From the perspective of hydrogen exports, there's really 3 different categories of export. And each of these categories have sort of different costs and different trade-offs, depending on what the planned in use is for that hydrogen. So in the first category is in uses that require pure hydrogen. And so in this case, that hydrogen needs to be cost competitive on a $1 per kilogram hydrogen basis. And so for pure hydrogen uses, this could be for things like fuel cells, potentially for manufacturing or chemical production, those sorts of things. One of the challenges about pure hydrogen is that we have to include the entire supply chain cost in the pure hydrogen. So if you're exporting ammonia, but you need pure hydrogen, you have to turn the ammonia back into pure hydrogen in order to use it. And on the alternative, if we're looking at energy carriers and fuels, this is where there's a little bit more flexibility because it could be pure hydrogen or it could be a derivative such as ammonia, methanol, sustainable aviation fuel, or something like that. And so the costs here are competing on more of an energy cost, dollars or euros per megawatt hour, per ton, per liter of fuel. And these costs are competing against the next best alternative, which is either electrification or likely biofuels from somewhere. The final category of potential exports is what I've just called industrial chemicals. And so this is the hydrogen derivative as the final product. This is something like ammonia being exported to turn into a fertilizer, or methanol being exported to use as an industrial chemical precursor. The benefit about industrial chemicals is that we have a pretty good idea of what the global market prices are likely to be over the next 10 years, as well as what the likely global demand is going to be for these. And so in some ways, these have a benefit of being a little bit more certain than the other two categories. So we'll go to the next slide. So looking at where hydrogen could be competitively produced across the world, you see a map here of the levelized cost of green hydrogen from hybrid plants combining solar with wind. And what you can see is there's a lot of areas that actually have the potential to produce low-cost hydrogen, which may be as low as $1.50 a kilogram by 2030. So you can see areas like Australia, India, sections of Africa, China, and Latin America, as well as interior portions of the United States, can all be competitive producers of low-cost hydrogen by 2030. And so if we go to the next slide, so this slide shows all of the announced hydrogen projects as of last year. And you can see that they actually align with a lot of those regions that have low hydrogen production costs. Or they are in Europe, which is expected to have a significant amount of hydrogen demand. And so you can see areas such as Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Latin America make up a lot of these green hydrogen projects that are planned so far. So we'll go to the next slide. Looking
Jesse,
a little bit...
we have a quick question too
Oh,
in
sure.
the Q&A. Are there carriers already available to transport hydrogen or its derivatives?
Yeah, and so you can actually see that here. So this is a flow chart of all of the announced agreements between producers and off-takers as of last year. And I want to point out the blue lines make up about 80% of this export volume. Those blue lines are actually ammonia. And so a significant amount of the import-export agreements that exist are already planning to import and export ammonia. So these hydrogen carriers include ammonia, they include methanol, and then there's some other somewhat more novel options, including liquid organic carriers. Ammonia and methanol are already transported by ships, by rail cars, in some cases by pipelines. And so a lot of the infrastructure for those particular hydrogen carriers can already exist or is relatively easy to implement. For pure hydrogen carriers, that's where it gets a little more complicated. Hydrogen gas mostly is only economically beneficial to transport by pipeline. And liquid hydrogen can be transported by ship or by truck at the moment, but it still makes up a relatively small proportion of the overall flow of imports and exports planned so far. You can also see from this figure that some of the major early importers of hydrogen are already starting to emerge. So the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and Korea to a smaller extent. But once again, going back to that issue of there being more production than demand so far, you can see that actually 60% of planned export projects don't have a identified destination country or off-taker yet. So once again, we're still in that issue where there's a lot of interest in production, but the interest in demand needs to catch back up. So we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, back onto the question about carriers and that infrastructure. So this is an example total supply chain cost for hydrogen exports in and imports in Northern Europe. And so what you can see is that on the left-hand side, you can see that domestic production in Northern Europe is competing against some of these other carriers or other alternatives. And what you can see is that if you need to end up with pure hydrogen, when you have to reconvert ammonia or methanol or that liquid organic hydrogen carrier back into pure hydrogen, then that gets actually more expensive than domestic production. Whereas transporting pure hydrogen in pipeline can be cost competitive against domestic production in Europe. And this is true for both North Africa and from delivery from Latin America. However, if the final product is ammonia, which is what you see over on the right-hand side, then you can see that the ammonia cost from some of these other regions can actually be lower cost than ammonia production in Europe. And so this comes back to that the question of what's the end user looking for when they're looking at clean hydrogen or clean hydrogen derivatives. And so the trade-off between hydrogen or those derivatives will really depend on what the end use needs are and what those costs are. So we can go to the next slide. So this is just a table kind of doing a quick comparison of all of those. I won't go through all of this right away. I just want to note that when you're comparing some of these different carriers, hydrogen gas, liquid hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, liquid organic carriers, each of them has sort of different benefits and costs associated with each of the stages in this entire supply chain. Conversion cost on the conversion side, if you need pure hydrogen and you can transport pure hydrogen, then that's sort of the most beneficial thing to do, because the other alternatives all require some amount of cost to convert them to the carrier. On the transportation side, hydrogen pipelines are one of the most cost-effective options if they're available. But if they're not available, then transporting pure hydrogen is very expensive, whereas shipping costs for especially ammonia and methanol are relatively low. And you also can transport those via rail.
Jesse, we have another question here in the Q&A. Do hydrogen pipelines already exist, or do we also go back to the issue of lack of infrastructure? I understand you cannot use gas pipelines to transport hydrogen.
There's approximately I think it's about 3,000 kilometers of pure hydrogen pipeline that already exist in the world. About 1,600, maybe it's more than that. I think there's 1,600 miles in the southern part of the United States. There's also a lot of hydrogen pipelines in industrial regions of Germany. And so the technology to build hydrogen pipelines does already exist. There's some sort of regulatory aspects of making pipelines more cost effective, but we do know that we can build hydrogen pipelines. For the existing natural gas pipelines, there's still a lot of unknowns about that. The general understanding is that in some cases, it may be possible to convert existing natural gas pipelines to hydrogen. But that will depend on the specifics of the material of that pipeline, the condition that it's in, the operation of that pipeline, and there's still a lot of unknowns about how cost effective that is. So there's actually an NREL project right now looking at costing a conversion of a natural gas pipeline to hydrogen on a section by section basis. And that's likely the kind of analysis that would be needed for another country to look at converting their own natural gas pipelines.
Thank you. We also have another question related to ammonia transport. So transporting ammonia is economic if the off-taker requires ammonia, but if they need hydrogen and thus cracking technology, which is not yet ready at scale, what is your take on this?
Yeah, there's I would say that if the general thinking probably right now is that if you need pure hydrogen, the best way to do it is to transport pure hydrogen. But if it's economical, you could transport ammonia or methanol and crack it back into hydrogen, and that may still actually be lower cost than liquid hydrogen transport, depending on some sort of project specifics. There's certainly a lot of research and development happening right now to improve the efficiency of ammonia cracking back into hydrogen, especially scaling that up to a much larger industrial scale to make it cost effective. So it's possible, especially if we're talking about sort of a 20 to 30 year time frame, that could be competitive. Right now, it seems likely that for pure hydrogen uses, pure hydrogen transportation via pipeline is going to be the most cost competitive option.
Great, thank you.
But of course, this gets a little more complicated if we start needing significant amounts of storage, because if you have access to salt caverns, pure hydrogen is relatively low cost to store. But if you have to use pressure tanks or something else, right now those costs are very high. And in comparison, it's much, much lower cost to store ammonia and methanol, especially if you need storage on the level of days or even weeks. So again, there's a lot of sort of cost trade-offs when we start talking about export markets, and they really do depend on multiple factors interplaying together. So we can go to the next slide. And so this just shows a little bit of that cost trade-off. We've kind of talked a lot about this already, so I'll just point out here that in both figures, you can see that for transportation distances up to somewhere in the order of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers, hydrogen pipelines are the most cost-effective option for transport. Once you get beyond those distances, or once you have to do sort of cross-sea shipping, then ammonia most generally is going to be the most cost-effective option for that. Whether or not liquid hydrogen is going to be cost-effective is really kind of unknown at this point. There's some studies that suggest that it really is only going to play a niche role, or it only plays a role if you need liquid ammonia as the end product. And there's some studies that say, well, it maybe can fill in the gap between the pipeline and the ammonia sort of cost optimal points. So just needless to say, there's still some uncertainty about this when it comes from going from sort of the study or the sort of R&D side of things to the real world market economy side of things.
And Jesse, there's a question here again on what is the minimum quantity you recommend for transporting ammonia? If you can elaborate on that a bit.
Oh, I don't have a number off the top of my head for that. I think it's really sort of a like how much hydrogen are you looking to transport? And what's your transport option? Certainly by the time you get to like a container ship or an ammonia ship, you sort of have a minimum amount of ammonia you want to transport on that ship. For hydrogen pipelines, there's sort of a minimum size of pipeline that makes it cost effective. Once you get below that size of pipeline, and that size is often somewhere around maybe 8 to 10 inches at the very low scale. Then you might look at something like ammonia rail car or truck transportation instead. So it really depends a lot on what's the production cost, what's the transportation distance, what's the end user. Without sort of like an in-depth analysis, it's hard to say just like, here's a number right offhand.
Thanks. Can you elaborate a little bit on the safety issues that are related to each of these transport technologies? Is there one or another that's less or more safe?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of safest, like sort of industrial safest option would be something like methanol, because it is a liquid at room temperature and pressure. Ammonia needs to be compressed or liquefied, and the pressures for ammonia compression are relatively small in comparison to hydrogen. But ammonia is still a toxic gas if it does leak. On the hydrogen side, hydrogen obviously has some issues with how difficult it is to store. It's very leaky. It has combustion properties that make it more likely to combust if there is a leak. But it also disperses relatively rapidly. And so, there's safety considerations from a sort of an industrial safety perspective. None of them at this point are unsolvable. They just require different levels of precautions. We have safety precautions for liquefied natural gas, for pressurized natural gas, for, the variety of industrial chemicals that are transported between industrial sites across the world. And for better or worse, we have regulations that deal with those, safety precautions that deal with those. And so, the carriers that we're talking about in this presentation aren't significantly different, or don't present new kinds of safety concerns that aren't already known about.
Thank you. And one other question going back to the economic analysis of hydrogen and other energy sources, where it was mentioned that you want to be able to produce it at about $1 per kilo. If you add the transport costs and storage costs and distribution costs and all those additional costs, it doesn't seem economically feasible. Would therefore supply need to be developed where the demand is, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's certainly, and if we go to the next slide, the next slide's my last slide in the presentation. This is one of the regional markets that's sort of being proposed and developed. In this case, this is the European hydrogen backbone. And the idea from the European hydrogen backbone is that there's areas of Europe, especially sort of the industrial areas around Germany, that are expected to be significant users of hydrogen. And they're expected to be significant enough hydrogen demand there that Germany won't be able to produce all of the hydrogen that it needs on its own. And so the idea of creating something like a regional economy where you have relatively low-cost transportation can help sort of work through those economic challenges of transportation and storage. And so in Europe, the idea is to create multiple different pipeline segments that go from different regions of Europe that have lower production costs, that have access to salt cavern or other geologic hydrogen storage. And so what this could create is sort of a whole regional economy that minimizes the overall supply chain costs of hydrogen production, transportation, storage, and use. Especially early on, by the early 2030s, I think the expectation is that a lot of hydrogen is likely to be produced where the demand is, if that's economically feasible. But not all places have good wind and solar resources that they can combine to produce hydrogen. And so rather than producing high cost hydrogen themselves, they're going to potentially look at getting lower cost hydrogen from other places. And so this is, the answer to your question is yes, and it depends. In a lot of ways, there's going to be some sort of case by case or project by project sort of economic cost evaluation. And it's really going to come down to what is the end user willing to pay for that hydrogen, and what are they willing to pay both on a pure economic or a pure market standpoint, and what are they willing to pay in order to meet regulations and policies. So in the case of Europe, they have very aggressive regulations and policies in place, even by 2030, to increase the amount of sustainable fuels and green hydrogen usage across their entire energy system. And so although that may lead to some higher costs, this is, those costs are seen as sort of part of meeting that regulatory requirement.
Great, thanks. And there's a question here related to what range of utilization would these hydrogen pipelines need to see to remain cost effective?
Yeah, that really depends on what's the cost to build the pipeline and how big the pipeline is. in general, the bigger the pipeline is, the lower comparative cost it is. And so the more flexibility you might have on somewhat lower utilization rates. This is the challenge that the European hydrogen backbone is currently trying to work through is, what's the cost of building out the pipeline that they think they need in 2040 or 2050? They were thinking about building, 30, 40, 48-inch pipeline sections, even though that utilization is going to be relatively small in the first 10 years. And so how do you manage that investment recovery for those early adopters with the expectation that in 10 or 20 years, you're going to need a pipeline of that size? So it really is, it's that economic question, but it's really also a policy and a regulatory question as well of, how much do you build now in anticipation for larger future demands versus building something smaller now with the potential that you might have to go back in and build something larger in 15 years.
Great, thanks. There's a lot of questions here on infrastructure. So one last one here on ammonia. There's an underground ammonia transport pipeline that starts in Louisiana and ends in Iowa for fertilizer. What is the probability of additional underground ammonia pipelines being built in the United States that you know of?
Oh, that is quite outside of my range of expertise at the moment. Yeah, it's hard to predict at this point. Also, ammonia pipelines are somewhat more cost effective than rail car, but the rail network already exists and we can already transport ammonia by rail. Building new pipelines, especially in the United States, is somewhat of a difficult prospect in some regions of the country. And so it's certainly difficult to predict whether or not a new pipeline could get built somewhere in the United States or not.
And I'd also like to invite our other presenters in the case that they have any responses to any of the questions that came up as well. Please feel free to intervene if you have anything to add. Okay, thanks, Jesse.
Just a question, Jesse, or let's say for a new hydrogen developer, right? Like, let's say you have a local market and you have potential for exporting that hydrogen. And I am wondering if you have any comment regarding what should be the focus, right? Should we focus first on local markets and then export opportunities for hydrogen? Or should we focus on exportation opportunities first and then local market, right? Like if you wait too much, too long to access the export market, then someone else could take that role, that place, right? So there are like pros and cons on each of those, let's say, approaches. And I want to know, like, what is your take or your opinion on that, or your recommendation on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that it, to some degree, it sort of depends on whether there's a likelihood for a local market developing early on. I've done a lot of work with some of the Baltic countries in Northern Europe, and they're all thinking ahead about participating on this hydrogen backbone, especially producing hydrogen to export to Germany, and whether or not their exports could be cost competitive with hydrogen being produced in Spain and Portugal that have just a phenomenal solar resource in comparison. And I think what countries I've worked with are kind of doing is they are thinking about what are their local hydrogen demands to be going to look like in order to meet sort of their climate or their energy goals. And at the same time, they're also thinking about how much hydrogen can we export to some of these big hydrogen off-takers. For countries that aren't necessarily looking at as strong of a local market development early on, then that's where they might want to start looking at export markets early on to see if they could be cost competitive with that. But again, there's the big issue that I've brought up time and time again is that there's not as much confirmed hydrogen demand as there is countries looking to produce and export. And so there really is a certain amount of risk to planning to export without having a without having an export destination and an export agreement already in place.
We just have a comment here in the Q&A, Jesse, just to flag that repurposing of natural gas pipelines to be used for hydrogen makes about 70% of the EHB network. EHB, I imagine, is European Hydrogen Backbone Network.
Yes, yes. That is the plan, is to repurpose as much as possible. And actually one little interesting tidbit, the United States actually repurposed a pair of liquid oil pipelines to run on hydrogen a couple of decades ago. And so there actually have been cases where a pipeline conversion has already happened. Again, I think the question really is, what's the overall cost of conversion, or in relation to sort of the cost of managing some of those challenges of conversion. And I think the European Hydrogen Backbone has sort of started with some estimates, but until there's sort of a widespread global, multiple projects that are actually doing it, we won't really know, how much conversion cost and how cost effective that is for sort of these sort of larger scale economic analyses.
All right, thank you. And it looks like we have a live question from Martine Fichel. Go ahead, Martine. Martine Fichel. Am I saying your name right? Okay, it looks like you're on mute in case you wanted to comment. Otherwise, you can put it in the Q&A. Okay. Back to you, Jesse.
Yeah, that kind of wraps up my part of the presentation. Happy to take any other questions, or if you think of something, I can hop back on the Q&A after Omar's presentation.
Great, thanks so much. So we are in the Q&A now. In case there were any additional questions, it looks like we were able to address all of the questions that were put in the Q&A and also in the chat, as far as I can see. But please feel free to raise your hand if you just want to say your question live, or also put it in the Q&A. And if anything occurs to you later as well, then you can put that in the Q&A as well. And hopefully Jesse will be able to stay with us for the next hour. Okay, great presentation. Thanks so much, Jesse. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danielle.
Wonderful. So now we're going to hop over to the Rodeo tool, Unlocking the Potential of Hydrogen Technologies, which is going to be presented by Omar Guerra. Again, this is our intention is to include one tool per webinar so that you can really dive into how these tools are used. They're all open source, free tools that you can access on the National Laboratory websites. And so we'll include the link to this tool in the chat as well. So Omar is going to talk about how this tool is used, what kinds of applications it can be used for, and how it relates to the development of market opportunities for hydrogen. So over to you, Omar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And what I'm going to do here is just to try to connect what Jesse was presenting around, opportunities for the deployment of hydrogen technologies with tools that could help to really evaluate those potential opportunities in terms of the economics, right? Are we talking about projects that are going to deliver hydrogen at $1 per kilogram or $3 per kilogram? And then you could understand, what are your cost drivers, what are your barriers in order to make those projects economically feasible. So I'm going to be focusing on Rodeo. Rodeo is the revenue, operation, and device optimization tool that was developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And what we did with this tool was really to kind of identify near-term opportunities for the deployment of hydrogen technologies. Next, please. First, let me talk a little bit about the demand of hydrogen, the potential evolution of that demand in the future. So here you can see a summary of the projected demand from the International Energy Agency, and this projection is associated with the net zero emissions energy sector by 2050. And here you can see the first that, hydrogen demand is expected to increase from, let's say, less than 100 million tons per year in 2020 to more than 500 million tons per year in 2050. So, a significant increase for hydrogen demand. So we need to produce more hydrogen, basically. Second, as we move from 2020 to 2050, you are going to see more colors in that demand. So that means that the demand for hydrogen is going to be more diverse. So we're going to have new uses of hydrogen in different sectors, including, for example, hydrogen blending with natural gas, seasonal energy storage, hydrogen for aviation and shipping, hydrogen for hard to decarbonize sectors, iron, steel, chemicals, etc. So in summary, right, like the demand for hydrogen is going to be more diverse. We are going to be using hydrogen for different applications across different sectors. And finally, if we want to use hydrogen as an energy carrier for the energy transition, we need to decarbonize hydrogen production, right? Like hydrogen needs to be carbon free, basically, if we want to use hydrogen to achieve net zero emissions energy sector by 2050. So we need to decarbonize hydrogen, and in order to do that, then we need to deploy low carbon hydrogen production technologies, for example, renewable driven water electrolysis, biomass gasification, etc. Where are those near-term opportunities? Those are key because, those are the opportunities that are gonna allow hydrogen to be deployed. So as Jesse was mentioning, most of those opportunities are associated with refineries. We use hydrogen today for hydrotreating and hydrocracking processes in refineries. We also use hydrogen for ammonia production. We're gonna, consume more food. We're gonna increase our population. That means that we're gonna need more food, and then we're gonna need more ammonia, basically. So, there are opportunities for ammonia production, and those are really, really relevant, particularly in the future, because demand for hydrogen could increase in that specific application. Then, Jesse was also mentioning the transportation aspects of hydrogen. And today we have, let's say, natural gas infrastructure that we use to deliver, natural gas to different end users. And if we have, hydrogen in a given location, and then we have demand for that hydrogen in a different location, we have basically two options, right? Like we could build a infrastructure to deliver that hydrogen, pure hydrogen, or we could blend that hydrogen with natural gas, existing or using existing natural gas infrastructure to deliver that hydrogen. So if we go with the second pathway, we may be able to reduce transportation costs for hydrogen, and then we could, just deliver that hydrogen either as a blend, or we could separate that hydrogen if we need to supply like pure hydrogen at the end use application. In general, I would say it is not a good idea to separate hydrogen from natural gas, because then you're gonna reduce the energy efficiency and increase the cost to deliver that hydrogen. But there are cases in which you may be able to use just the blend, right? Like let's say natural gas plus 20% hydrogen for power generation. That is, an application that from the technological point of view is feasible, because there are different, gas turbines that could generate power with up to 20 or 15% hydrogen in that natural gas blend. So there are opportunities there that could be, interesting to evaluate. Next, please. So now, a hydrogen project is really complex and involves different levels of decision making. So on the left, you can see a summary of all of those decisions that we need to make regarding hydrogen projects. And those decisions goes from, pure like process design, process analysis, to more kind of supply chain analysis or design, as well as life cycle analysis, right? For example, if you have an electrolyzer, you're going to be doing water electrolysis. You don't have local emissions in your facility, but then depending on the supply of that energy, then you may have some emissions associated with that production of hydrogen. So we need to do, let's say, life cycle analysis in order to quantify those emissions that are not, located in your specific facility. I got a question here from Camilo Gonzalez. Blending has a max of hydrogen in order to transport in a gas pipeline, correct? I understand that that is related to the potential combustion. There are many constraints, Camilo. It depends on the materials of the pipe. It also depends on the combustion capabilities of the final gas turbine. And I think there are gonna be limits, but those limits depends on the specific case. I cannot tell you, like, you know, you could go up to 20% or 15% or 5%. In some cases, you may go up to 20, depending on the specific materials, how old is that pipeline, for example. Which combustion turbine technology do you have? Do you have a combustion turbine technology that could operate up to, let's say, 50% hydrogen blends, or just 20%, or just 5%? So the constraint could be driven by either, you know, the materials or the characteristics of the pipeline, or the characteristics of the end use application. Thank you for your question. Back to Rodeo, right? So we're gonna make a bunch of decisions across the whole supply chain of hydrogen, and for each of those decisions, we're gonna need models to support that decision-making process, right? For example, for supply chain, we have a model called Guerra, or for life cycle analysis, we could use Grid to quantify those emissions across the whole life cycle of our facility. We could do also like market adoption and decision analysis at the system integration level. And then we are going to use tools, for example, H2Fast, to understand the financial aspects of those hydrogen projects, etc. So, you know, hydrogen projects involve decision making across different levels, and we are going to need models to support those decisions. On the left, you can see a summary of 4 models that were developed by NREL. And the idea with those models is to provide a framework to support decisions across different levels of the supply chain for hydrogen. For example, first we have the H2A model. This is a pure, let's say, process system analysis model in which you are going to be able to understand, you know, materials and energy flows across your entire facility, including, you know, temperature, concentrations, pressures, etc., as well as, for example, opportunities for heat integration in your facility. Then we have Rodeo, the revenue, operation, and device optimization tool. And this tool focuses mostly on the design and optimization of your integrated hydrogen facility. So now we are going to be able to optimize, you know, the integration with the electricity markets, the hourly operation of your electrolyzer, for example, in view of dynamic electricity prices or dynamic output or input, from the solar PV or wind facility. Then we have the Guerra model. Guerra is basically a supply chain design model in which we are going to determine what is the best option for production, storage, transportation, and delivery of hydrogen. For example, do we need to build a new hydrogen pipeline from point A to point B, or do we want just to deploy decentralized hydrogen production near the demand to minimize infrastructure investment, for example? Those are the type of questions that Guerra is going to be able to answer. And finally, we have the financial tool, hydrogen financial analysis scenario tool called H2Fast. And in my opinion, this is perhaps the most critical tool, because this tool could help us to understand or quantify the risk associated with those hydrogen projects, right? Like, what is your cost driver? What is your risk driver? What are your biggest uncertainties? How do you minimize those uncertainties? Which is the, you know, the most appropriate financial structure for your project? So those are critical aspects that are going to really help you to make a final decision regarding those potential opportunities for investment. Next, please. So why we develop Rodeo? So, you know, before Rodeo, hydrogen analysis was, you know, based on considering that the electrolyzer was a constant electricity load, and that you could produce just, you know, flat operation or flat supply of renewables, and multi-sector integration was not considered. Those interaction between the electricity sector and the electrolyzer and the end use application, for example, were not considered. I have another question from Camilo. Are you aware of any bank, funds, or multilateral agency providing low-rate funds for developing these projects? That is a very interesting question. I don't know, Daniela, if you have any comment on this. I think you are in a better position than myself to answer that question from Camilo Gonzalez.
So we know of multilateral development banks such as IDB or IADB that are quite interested in hydrogen and supporting hydrogen in a number of the countries that we work with. I don't know, specifically what low rates are being provided. And I think it varies significantly by country and the level of risk by country. But this is certainly an area that multilateral development banks are quite interested in helping to promote in this early stage of international market development. We're not seeing as much interest from kind of the local banks as there seems to be more of a perceived risk. And so we've been making a lot of effort to provide economic analysis tools to kind of more local banks or national banks so that they can look at hydrogen opportunities as they come along or are put on their desk and evaluate, the risk profile of those projects or the potential revenue generation. But again, it varies so much by country, by application, by region, depending on the renewable energy resources that you have. So yes, there is interest. And certainly we're seeing more of that kind of revenue flow coming from the multilateral development banks that are hoping to support the early market development.
Thank you, Daniela, for your help. Again, before rodeo, hydrogen electrolyzers were considered like constant load for the power grid. And then there was lack of consideration regarding multi-sector integration. However, as we increase the share of renewables in the system, in the power system or in the energy system, right? Like as we integrate more wind and solar into the system, then you're gonna see more fluctuations in the electricity prices, more opportunities to use, let's say, otherwise curtail wind and solar power. And then we need to capture that flexibility, right? Like we know that electrolyzers could be flexible, and then we could use that flexibility to take advantage of, dynamic renewable power outputs or dynamic electricity prices in order to minimize costs that, is at the end the final goal. So we work together with the Department of Energy as well as with some local entities from California to develop the open source tool Rodeo, or Revenue and Operation Device Optimization tool. So Rodeo is open source that uses advanced optimization techniques, including multi-sector integration, multi-value stream, as well as flexible operations of the hydrogen systems. And the idea with this tool is basically, to optimize the design and operation of the hydrogen facilities and reduce the cost, including, environmental considerations in this analysis. Next, please. So something, that I think was very important when I think there is one slide back, Daniela, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Something very interesting that we did with Rodeo was that we worked together with public entities at the federal and local level. For example, the hiring office from the Department of Energy, as well as, for example, the California Energy Commission, together with private entities, including oil and gas companies, electric utility companies, etc., to identify near-term opportunities for hydrogen technologies. So we have been using Rodeo for more than 15 hydrogen projects evaluation, including, both public as well as the private sector. And all of those projects combined represents a budget of more than $2.5 million just for doing the economic analysis using Rodeo, right? So, significant amount of money involved in all of those projects that were evaluated using this tool. And I think the key here was working together with public and private sector, I think was key to identify those near-term opportunities. Next, please. Now, previous, there we go. Now, just to be more specific, right? Like, for example, with Rodeo, we were able to identify that hydrogen could be a cost-effective alternative for long-duration energy storage. We also evaluated the application of hydrogen for heavy-duty transportation, and we were able to identify some specific cases where hydrogen was competitive with the alternative for heavy-duty transportation. A key application, I think, where hydrogen could play a significant role. We also did some work related to hydrogen blending with natural gas, understanding, the regulation as well as potential limitations associated with the technological aspects of those opportunities. And finally, we also did kind of power to gas and power to hydrogen analysis for the industrial sector, including, the use of hydrogen for example, ammonia or for iron and steel production. So in summary, Rodeo has been used to identify key opportunities for the deployment of hydrogen technologies. Next, please. Now let me talk a little bit more about Rodeo, right? Like the workflow that is implemented in Rodeo. So on the left, you can see a diagram that summarizes. Thank you, Camilo, for your question. Have you only applied Rodeo in US? Yes and no. Mostly US, I will say, but we also had a project with Woodside Company. It's a company from Australia. So we have been using also Rodeo for international projects, but I would say that mostly Rodeo has been used for projects in the US. We are working with Daniella to, let's say, develop kind of test cases, more like in a international frame, to make sure that, we are more like open to other conditions from other countries. So most of the focus has been in the US. There are some, maybe 1 or 2 case studies outside of the US that we did with Rodeo, but we are planning to use Rodeo more for international projects to make sure that, people could use it outside of the US. Thank you. So this is the structure of the model. In this diagram on the left, you have kind of a summary of the input. For example, we have utility service input. We have energy prices, time series with dynamic prices, basically, demand charges. Those are, the price that you're gonna pay for your power demand, not just for energy. Then we have the independent system operator or regional transmission operator electricity markets information. For example, price for energy, ancillary services, capacity value if you use hydrogen as a energy storage device. Then you have other inputs, for example, the operational parameters. A key parameter could be, for example, what is the minimum partial load for the electrolyzer? Renewable generation, we have wind, solar, time series, additional load, the demand for hydrogen. Are we talking about a flat demand for hydrogen or a very dynamic demand for hydrogen? Because that is going to impact the requirements for hydrogen storage or energy storage. Then we have the financial inputs. What is the financing structure for your project? Financial parameters, equipment cost, and credits and incentives. And this point, like credits and incentive, is critical because particularly for new projects or near-term opportunities, those incentives could be the driver. Sometimes the technology could not be cost competitive, but then if you put the right incentive, then the technology could become competitive, right? And we want to understand those opportunities. Then with this input information, we run a optimization model. It's a mixed interlinear programming model that is going to determine, the optimal operational profile in a hourly basis, as well as the project economics, cost breakdown, net present value, etc. So regarding applications, we have been using Rodeo for many applications. For example, retail rate optimization. This is basically integration of the electrolyzer with the electricity market, real-time optimization and control for the electrolyzer, vehicle fleet optimization, integration with different electricity market, as well as hydrogen business cases assessment. Basically being able to identify, should you focus on ammonia production or energy storage or hydrogen for transportation, for example. Next, please.
There's a question in the
Yep.
chat. Does Rodeo consider the environmental impacts of technologies to control nitrogen oxides or nitrous oxide? So it might be a good opportunity to mention kind of the differences between Rodeo and GREET.
Yep.
And also maybe when you're going into that, it might be worth mentioning what are the differences between Rodeo and H2 Fast, which we'll be covering later on in the series. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, Rodeo is more like plant or facility level analysis. We don't do like life cycle analysis. For that aspect, I would say GREET is the tool to go or to use. So Rodeo is able to quantify carbon emissions of the facility, but not the life cycle emissions. And also we only include CO2, so we are not including any additional emissions. So I would say that all of those tools, the idea is that you are gonna make decisions across different levels. For each level, you're gonna have different tools that could help you to understand the decisions that you have to make. And then I think a more integrated approach is gonna be useful. For example, H2 Fast is gonna help you to understand the financial aspect, the risk aspects of your project. Rodeo is gonna be able to quantify, you know, the cost breakdown of your hydrogen project. How much is the cost of electricity? How much is gonna be the cost of your electrolyzer? What is your minimum selling price for hydrogen? And then you could go to H2 Fast to do the financial analysis. Okay, now I know that the project could be feasible under those conditions. Now I go to H2 Fast and I put different financial parameters. I understand the risk. I evaluate those uncertainties and quantify those risks associated with your hydrogen project. So H2 Fast is kind of more simulation tool. So you put different designs with different parameters, with different uncertainties, and then you run those risk analysis. So answering your question, I would say, you know, we are able to quantify carbon emissions at the facility level, not at the life cycle level, but we are not able to analyze any additional emissions from end use applications because the focus of Rodeo is in the facility level analysis, right? We want to just design the facility to produce hydrogen and optimize the hourly operation of that facility. For the life cycle, I would say emission analysis, I would say GREET is the model to go. For the financial analysis, I would say H2 Fast is the tool to go. That doesn't mean that you don't have to use Rodeo or H2A model, right? That means that you may need to, depending on the question that you have, you may need to use different tools. So now the question is, how do you get a Rodeo? Another question, I think. Joseph, what is the spatial resolution of Rodeo? And if you do not consider spatial input, how to account for renewable energy potential? Do you take that as input? Very interesting question. We work more at the facility level. I think Guerra is more kind of supply chain design tool that takes into account that spatial granularity or component of the decision analysis. But we did a project in which we combined Rodeo with Guerra. So for each potential location, for example, we use Rodeo to design the facility, and then we include different predefined designs for those facilities, and those options were analyzed using Guerra. So no, Rodeo doesn't consider that the spatial resolution because we focus mostly on the facility level analysis, but we are able to integrate Rodeo with Guerra and have more kind of two-level approach in which you have a facility level design using Rodeo or based on Rodeo, and then a supply chain design level based on Guerra. So Rodeo is going to provide different options for the design of each facility, depending on, let's say, if you have wind or solar or wood solar or opportunity for underground storage, for example. And then Guerra is going to combine all of those alternatives across different locations to determine the appropriate or the most cost-effective supply chain for that specific opportunity.
And Omar, just addressing in that question, he's saying how to account for the renewable energy potential. Then would you be using another tool to evaluate what the solar or wind potential is in that location and inputting that into the model?
Yeah, for example, the National solar radiation database, NSRDB, is a tool that allows you to evaluate the potential for solar PV in different locations. So you go to that tool and then you get the solar PV profile, for example, for different locations. Or we have, other tools or databases in which you could access the renewable potential for a given location. So those are inputs. We are not doing that with Rodeo. You have different, databases or tools that you could use to estimate the potential for your wind or solar facility. And something important here, Joseph, is it is important to capture not only the intra-annual variability of those resources, but also the inter-annual variability, right? Imagine you pick a year with a really, really good wind for a given location and say, oh, the project is economically feasible. I am going to be able to produce hydrogen at, I don't know, $1 per kilogram, because you pick a really nice year for wind generation in that specific site. But if you move to another year, you may have a drop of, I don't know, 50% in the capacity factor of your wind facility. And then that is going to impact the economics of your hydrogen project. So you want to consider all of these long-term implications of having a more uncertain and variable renewable output. So you want to capture different scenarios or to design different scenarios to capture the intra-annual variability as well as the inter-annual variability in your decision-making process. So this is very critical and very important. And that is going to also impact your financial analysis or your risk analysis. If you have more kind of stable, let's say, generation of those resources, then that is going to be better from the economics and risk analysis point of view, because you're going to have more stable estimations of your hydrogen production costs. So I think at this point, right, we know that Rodeo could be useful, could be an interesting tool to use. So now the question is, how do you get Rodeo? So there is a GitHub repository in which you could access NREL. You have the website here in this link. In addition to that, the Rodeo model is called storage dispatch.gams. So Rodeo was developed in GAMS. GAMS is the generic modeling system, generic algebraic modeling system, in which you could solve different optimization problems. Next, please. In this folder, you have also access to different projects. For example, if you click projects over here, then you're going to be able to see different test cases that we developed using Rodeo. And those cases include, for example, applications for, let's say, just solar-driven hydrogen production or solar plus energy storage. We also did some projects associated with transportation sector, etc. So, you have here different set of projects that you could use to really understand how the model works, the type of output, the type of input that are needed. Also, we have a very interesting case regarding centralized versus decentralized hydrogen production. As Jesse was mentioning, right, like hydrogen infrastructure is difficult to build because it's a cost-intensive, let's say, infrastructure. And then there is this question, right, like, should you just produce hydrogen at a large scale where you have good wind or solar resources and building infrastructure to deliver that hydrogen to end users across the country, or do you want to deploy decentralized hydrogen production to minimize the requirements for infrastructure to deliver that hydrogen? So all of those questions, could be analyzed using Rodeo, but more at the facility level, right? And you could just analyze them in the context of your country, and that is important, right? Like, we don't have a specific answer that could apply to every location. Like, every case is going to be different because the cost is going to depend on the location, on the resource that you have, on the infrastructure that you may have in place. For example, do you have a gas pipeline that you could use to deliver that hydrogen to different end users? So there are not, like, global answer to those questions or unique answer to those questions. Each project or each opportunity needs to be analyzed in the specific local context. I think there was a question, Daniela. I don't know if that question was answered or.
You've answered all questions. Thanks.
Oh, okay, perfect. Next, please. Now, in each of those projects, for example, if you click in the solar hydrogen project, and now you're going to be able to folders, data files. This is a folder where you put all your inputs, either in a CSV format or as a TXT format. And then you have the output folder in which you're going to collect the output from the models. So those are basically, CSV files, where you are able to see, the summary of the economics of your project, your cost breakdown, as well as your hourly operation of the electrolyzer, hourly output from the solar PV or wind facility. You're gonna also be able to evaluate, or to see the market integration strategy, for example, in which hour are you gonna be selling just, renewable power to the grid, or in which hours are you going to be using just renewable power for running the electrolyzer? We have another question here from Rodrigo Chaparro. Have you modeled green ammonia production case with Rodeo? Not yet, but we are planning to do that. We are planning to develop a ammonia case that is going to be open source, and hopefully it's going to be here in this database, so you may be able to have access to that test case. Thank you, Rodrigo, for your question. Next, please. Next slide, please. This one, sorry. Yeah. So now how do you run Rodeo, right? So Rodeo was developed in the GAMS platform. GAMS is the generic algebraic modeling system in which you are able to solve different optimization problems, including mixed interlinear programming problems, or linear programming problems, or non-linear programming problems, for example. So first we go and open the folder. On the left, you can see folder with the model and data. So you open that folder in GAMS, and then you click the Rodeo model called storage dispatch bullseye.gams in this case. And then you have a button in which you can run Rodeo. And in the model itself, you have a description of the Rodeo model. We explain what is, the intention with each constraint or with each equation in the model. It's kind of a complex model because we consider a lot of integration options for the hydrogen production facility. But, it is open source, and also we have, a good, I will say, documentation in the model. And also we are open to take any, question or request from you guys if you have any specific question regarding how to run the model or the interpretation of a given parameter in the model. So, if you have any question, please let us know. But this is an open source tool that could be really useful for understanding the economics and drivers of hydrogen production facilities. Next, please. So the previous was like kind of the boring part, right? Like just going through the GitHub and the GAMS platform. But now let me talk about what does Rodeo do. So here you can see a summary of different options for a hydrogen or electrolytic hydrogen production facility. On the top, you have the islanded case in which we have just a solar PV panel connected to an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen. So we have no integration with the electricity sector. Then we move to more kind of integrated approaches. For example, in the hybrid retail wholesale electricity integration, we have a solar PV panel that could sell power, renewable power to the grid at a given price, or could deliver that power to the electrolyzer. And then we have an electrolyzer that could access the retail market from the electricity sector, or renewable power from the solar PV panel to produce hydrogen. So the idea here is to evaluate all of those market configurations, including, production, compression, and storage of that hydrogen, to evaluate, what is the most cost-effective alternative for hydrogen production in view of, electricity market integration.
I have a couple questions here. So one,
Mhm.
does the user need to have a GAMS license? What solver is used?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. We typically use Cplex, but in theory, any MILP solver could be useful, including Cplex, Gurobi, Express, etc. The good news is that we are planning to develop a Python or Julia version of Rodeo to make sure that you don't need to pay for any license and you're going to be able to use Rodeo as a kind of fully open source tool.
Great.
Thank
And then
you
we
for your
also have
question.
another question in the chat. Is EV
Mhm.
based on hydrogen, electromobility based on hydrogen modeled?
Yep, we are going to be able to we are able to evaluate those cases, and I think there is a test case in the GitHub repository for electric vehicles application. And let me just talk a little bit about it, because I think for just urban transportation, like inside a cities, I would say forget about hydrogen for that application, because I think electric vehicles are going to be more cost effective. But if we are talking about heavy duty applications or medium duty application, I would say hydrogen could compete in that specific sector. So depending on the specific application, I would say hydrogen could be cost effective, particularly for those heavy duty transportation where you need significant autonomy. And I think hydrogen could be really, really interesting for that specific type of applications. Thank you. Next, please. What does Rodeo provide, right? Like if you have a case study and then you run Rodeo, what do you get out of Rodeo? What is the information that you're gonna get from Rodeo? So here you can see a summary of all of those alternatives that I had in the previous slide in terms of the economics. What is your hydrogen production cost? As you may see here, the most expensive system is the islanded scenario, in which basically, you have just the solar PV plus the electrolyzer to produce hydrogen. And then as you move to more integrated system, you're going to be able to reduce that cost to almost $2.6 per kilogram of hydrogen. And, that tells you that, integration is a good thing for hydrogen system, because you are going to be able to play with electricity markets and minimize your electricity or your hydrogen production cost. And I think, what is even more important here is that you're going to be able to understand your cost breakdown. So for each system that I presented in the previous slide, now you have a specific cost breakdown, and you're going to be able to understand your cost driver. For example, for the islanded scenario, where you don't have any integration with the electricity sector, you see that, the CapEx for the solar PV plant is a driver, as well as the storage and compression cost. Right, because you have less flexibility from the electrolyzer point of view to produce hydrogen, so you need more compression and storage. Then, as you move to more integrated systems, now you see that your cost driver is your electricity cost, because now you're relying more on electricity from the grid, and you may be able actually to sell power from the renewable facility, let's say the solar PV or the wind facility, to the electricity market during hours in which you have higher prices. So you have very high prices from the electricity market, you don't produce hydrogen, and instead of that, you just sell renewable power to the grid during those specific hours in which you have really high prices. So this is very important, because now you are going to be able to understand, those dynamics of your hydrogen production system. For example, this case was for California, and we included the analysis of low carbon fuel standard credits that are going to be associated with, the carbon footprint of your hydrogen. So if you have the landed scenario in which you are using just solar PV power to run your electrolyzer, then, you're going to be able to get a significant incentive from the low carbon fuel standard credits. But if you move to more integrated system with the retail market, now you have emissions coming from the electricity that you're getting from the grid. And that electricity has a given carbon footprint that is going to reduce the credit that you're going to get from the low carbon fuel standard incentive, right? So understanding all of those dynamics is very, very relevant. In this case, we have 2 megawatt solar PV facility. And then on the right, you can see, the optimal size of the electrolyzer. For example, are we talking about 1.2 megawatt electrolyzer operating at almost 30 or 32% capacity factor? Because, the solar PV is not going to be able to provide power during, hours in which you don't have the sun available. So you're going to be able to understand, what is the optimal capacity factor for your electrolyzer, what is the capacity factor for that electrolyzer, and what is the optimal hydrogen production rate? Are we talking about, just, 164 kilograms of hydrogen per day, or are we talking about, 727 kilograms of hydrogen per day, for example? So key output here, Rodeo can provide, the cost breakdown for your project and the optimal system configuration for a given scenario. Rodeo is going to be able to identify those drivers for the design and operation as well, right? Like, do we want to just use renewable power to maximize the incentive that we're going to get from the low carbon fuel standard credit? Or, sorry, do you want to do, integration with the electricity markets to get cheaper electricity, and you may reduce your incentive, but then you're going to be able to reduce your hydrogen production cost because now you're using cheaper electricity from the grid, for example. So you're going to be able to understand all of those, options or alternative to reduce your hydrogen production cost. And finally, Rodeo is going to be able to identify the optimal design and operation of your electrolyzer. Capacity, how many megawatts do you need? How much storage do you need? Do you need just 8 hours of storage for hydrogen? Or do you need 12 or 20 or 15 hours of storage for your hydrogen? What is the optimal capacity factor? Do you want to operate your electrolyzer as a just, base load facility? Or do you want to have more kind of dynamic operation to take advantage of dynamics from the electricity markets or from your on-site renewable facility? So next, please. I think this is
Omar,
my last.
We do have one question in the chat. What are the risk metrics for integrated systems and dynamic cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, I think one metric, we typically talk about just production cost, dollar per kilogram, right, for hydrogen production. I think the first step is to really understand what is that gap, right? Like, yes, in one specific condition, you may be able to produce hydrogen at, let's say, $1.5 per kilogram. But what happens if you move to a different year where you have less solar? How is that less solar availability going to impact your production cost? Are we talking about, moving from $1.5 per kilogram in the base case to $1.6 per kilogram when you have less solar? Or are we talking about moving from $1.5 per kilogram to $4 per kilogram? Because that could make your project economically infeasible. So being able to understand this range of cost is the first step, I would say. Understanding the standard deviation of your estimated hydrogen production cost is key, because then you're going to be able to understand your opportunities, right? If, let's say, 50% of the cases, you're going to be producing hydrogen above $3 per kilogram, that means that you're not going to be able to sell that hydrogen for applications that are able to pay maybe $1 or just $2 per kilogram for that hydrogen. So being able to understand that standard deviation of your estimated hydrogen production cost, I think is the first metric that you should quantify. Of course, there are, other metrics, I don't want just to expand too much on that aspect, but I would say understanding that gap, I think is the basic. Understanding, what is your minimum and maximum hydrogen production cost, considering all of those uncertainties regarding, solar PV output, electricity market prices, technology cost for the electrolyzer, etc.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank
Any
you.
questions? I don't see any new ones in the Q&A, but just checking. Okay. So I have a few questions for you guys to kind of wrap things up. And this would be some questions for everyone, and you can pick maybe which one you want. But, we've talked about, will demand actually catch up with production? What are kind of the key enabling conditions to make that happen? We know hydrogen, is in demand by everybody in terms of preparing themselves to participate in future markets. But it's also very controversial. Many say it's climate's Swiss Army knife and can address all decarbonization applications, but others say that there's more economic and efficient solutions for many of these applications, and we should only use hydrogen for hard to abate sectors. If you're advising governments governments or countries looking to develop a hydrogen market, how would you advise them on this topic? We know that, with oil and gas, for example, only a few countries can produce it. With hydrogen, anyone can produce it, but should everyone produce it? And maybe if you're not as competitive with your production costs, should you only look at more domestic applications? Or do you see, for international export, only a few competitive regions will really be able to participate in future markets? Kind of based on, this discussion, what are the real opportunities in these global markets looking forward?
I think, I think, the first step is to make sure you really understand your options, right? Like, okay, I have this application. Which are your options? Direct electrification, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then understanding your renewable resources. Do you have wind? Do you have solar? Do you have hydro? And then try to analyze all of those options in a more kind of holistic way and more neutral way, trying to avoid biases. We are humans. We tend to have a bunch of biases, and I think we better, put aside those biases when we analyze those alternatives from a national point of view. It's very, very important to be more kind of, bias-free, I would say, to do this type of analysis. Understanding, renewable resources that you have in place, which options do you have, or which alternative do you have, and also analyzing all of those like holistic, or I would say more like comprehensive view of the problem, right? Are you gonna be able to develop a local, economic around a given technology? Could be hydrogen, could be, I don't know, lithium-ion batteries or any other technology. Are you gonna be able to build those technologies in your country? Because that is gonna impact, job opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to consider all of those aspects to make a more reasonable assessment of the specific application and the options that should be developed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Jesse, did you have anything to add to that? And I guess one question to add to that question is, are clusters or hubs kind of where we should be starting, from an infrastructure and investment standpoint, or where are these early opportunities that we're seeing, for example, maybe with ammonia and agriculture as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Omar said. I would say, especially, if there are sort of domestic opportunities where, hydrogen really is likely to be that key player, if you have a local refinery, if you have ammonia or fertilizer production, definitely areas where hydrogen is most likely going to be a player is a good place to start. From an infrastructure standpoint, we don't know exactly what the hydrogen economy is going to look like in 2040, 2050. And if there's a significant hydrogen economy, both regionally and both global, we're talking about rebuilding a whole new set of infrastructure to some degree that we've spent the last 50 to 100 years building out for a natural gas and a fossil fuel system. And so, that's a lot of investment, that's a lot of costs. One of the benefits of starting with a regional hub, a hydrogen production hub, or a hydrogen valley sort of perspective is that you can sort of limit the amount of wide scale infrastructure that you build right off the bat. You might still end up building some hydrogen pipelines, but 50 kilometers is much easier to get funding for than 500 or 2,000 kilometers of pipeline. Transportation and storage of hydrogen can be expensive. So co-locating your production with your likely demand centers can be a way to sort of cut down on some of those costs early on from your domestic perspective. For an international export perspective, it's really a question at this point of sort of bilateral producers versus off-takers. We're not at the point yet where there's sort of a huge economy where you can produce it and assume that you're just going to have an off-taker. We're still very much in those early stages of development, and so it's really bilateral agreements. A country and a producer, a business working with another country and an off-taker, and that's likely to be true for probably at least the next 10 years or so. And so not jumping into saying we're going to produce a lot of hydrogen for export, we don't know where it's going, is definitely a more risky proposition than really focusing on, very specific, domestic needs and very specific agreements for import-export.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Timothy, if you had anything you wanted to add and any last remarks on where we're seeing these market opportunities today, any wise words of advice to our country counterparts?
No, but just understand that there's those of us within the Office of International Affairs that are working on this issue for those that are here today of those countries. Of course, I focus more on the Western Hemisphere, but happy to share my contact information. And if anybody has any questions for your particular country and the potential cooperation we can do at the policy level here at the Department of Energy, please reach out to me and I can connect you to the right counterpart if it's not within the Western Hemisphere. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Timothy. Thanks, Omar. Thanks, Jesse. Really amazing presentations. Thanks for all the wonderful participation from everyone that joined us today. Please don't forget to join us. We have 3 more webinars coming up focused on international hydrogen landscapes, analytical tools, including the H2 FAST that we already mentioned for financial analysis, and as well as kind of synthesis activities to apply all of the knowledge that you've gained. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day or evening, and hope to see you next time. Cheers. Bye.